Okay, so the current lid is not going well whatsoever. I'm not happy with it at all, and I think we're going to be doing a little bit of a do-over on it. Now, this really sucks because we have a decent amount of walnut in this, and even the cherry in it is very expensive. This is a lot of wood in here, but I'm not going to be just throwing it out, obviously. I'm going to just save it, and if I decide to use it in the future for something, then I can. The only thing that's really making me mad about this top is that I screwed up on one of the breadboard ends. I didn't notice this when I did the glue up, but our one breadboard end on this side is loose. It wobbles around and it's just horrible. It really makes me mad. And so the other thing that I'm not a huge fan of, but was kind of doable, is just the overall design of it. The problem is that I have with it right now is that it's just too simple. It's just a flat piece of wood, and I was just going to put a simple round over on it and call it a day. And so when you compare that to like the side panels here, again, I'm only at the sanding stage. You guys are way ahead of me, so let me know how it looks. But if you compare it to the rest of the trunk here, everything else looks so much better. We've got all this depth, we've got all this, intricate detail in here, and then the lid would just be a flat piece of wood, which they don't go together in my mind. And as soon as I glued this up, I really regretted it because I couldn't reconcile it in my brain as something that was going to work out well. And so there's two big things I'm going to be doing different compared to our current lid. What I want to do on the new lid is I want to make it frame and panel instead of a breadboard end top like this. Because what I don't like about this panel is the fact that it's a breadboard end top. I think it's like a tabletop or something where you're working on it. Yes, breadboard ends make sense. If you're eating off it, whatever, yes, it makes sense. But something like a lid of a trunk, it doesn't make sense to have a breadboard end top because although it's nice and flat, it's supposed to be a decorative piece of furniture. So if we can get that cove profile in there with the frame and panel, that'll be really cool too. We can still get all our nice little dowel designs in there too because we'll just put those same things in with mortise and tenon joinery because we're still going to be doing a mortise and tenon frame on this, and then putting in a floating panel, which overall that will just be a much better built design and will be much stronger. And the other big thing that I want to do on the new one is I want less walnut. Now it sounds crazy, but it's just what I've come across here. I don't like how big the walnut is. It feels overpowering compared to the cherry that we have in the middle here. Okay, so before we start cutting this piece into strips, I just want to talk quickly about this method and a little bit of safety precautions you should take. So this is a big piece of lumber. It's 42 inches long and about 10.5 inches wide. It's not super heavy, but I definitely need two hands to handle this thing. So what you want to make sure of when you're at the bandsaw is that you have proper supports in place. So on this side of the bandsaw, I can very easily hold it with two hands, very securely, very safely, and still guide it through the blade. Whereas on that end, I can't actually hold it in any way. I can't get this arm safely back here without putting my arm at risk from going into the blade. So what I want to make sure of is on the offcut side, I have something else over there to support it. So I have a little roller stand. Now this is a cheap little roller stand from Home Depot. They work really well. Alright, so now we've got all of our pieces roughly milled out. We've got both sides surfaced and all of our edges nicely squared up so we can glue up a nice square panel. And so what we're going to be doing is two separate glue ups. Our first glue up, we're going to do 5 and 6 because I only need 11 out of the 12 pieces I just cut because luckily I was able to cut a little bit oversized. We'll get to that in just a second here. And so we're going to be doing two separate glue ups. That way I can still pass them through my planer easily. If I was to do the full glue up of all 11 pieces that I need, I wouldn't be able to use my planer anymore or any other means of flattening it, which would make it much harder later on when we want to add the cove profile and rabbet around this thing. So we're going to start with the 2 glue ups first off, and then we're going to glue the final thing together. Then we only have one seam that we need to clean up, and that needs to be accurately put together. We know that those 2 big pieces are going to be perfectly flat, and it'll be much easier to just in general clean up after that. So I already mentioned that we have one extra piece here. Now you might be wondering why I did that. So the reason for that extra piece is purely because I didn't think that I was actually going to be able to get this much extra width. And so the reason for that is because I was able to get 1 7/8 out of most of these pieces, whereas normally I'm only able to get like 1 3/4 out of 8/4 stock like this. And so the piece of chair that I went out and bought was already nice and flat. It didn't really have any craziness. You know, there was no big dips or anything in it. So I was able to get that 1 7/8 width out of most of these pieces, which means we now only need 11 instead of the 12 that I was expecting. So we just now have a nice extra piece sitting there. Again, I use this stuff all the time. If I can split this piece in half to get a 1/2 inch, to get 2 1/2 inch pieces, or I can find another use for it again in the future at some point. So this actually works out a lot better because when you have 11 pieces, you're always going to be able to see your seams in your panels. It's even when we're doing stuff like this where we've got good, clean, straight grain blending them, you're still going to be able to see the seams. So having a central piece rather than a seam down the middle is just more visually, just makes more sense visually. And so the main thing I'm looking for when I'm mixing and matching these pieces is grain direction that makes sense. So a good example of this is these 2 pieces right here. On this one, the grain is coming in at a diagonal starting from that corner and coming in at this way. On this one, the grain is coming fairly straight down. So these 2, whether they're like that, they blend together pretty well. Same thing if I was to flip this one around and now our grain is going the opposite diagonal, they still make sense. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to mix 2 pieces that are going the same direction because it just doesn't look really good. And so starting on the frame for the frame and panel of this lid, there's some very specific things you want to do when you're making something like this that'd be different if you're just making a standard frame and panel. So typically when you're making a frame and panel, whether it's for the side of the thing, for a door, whatever it may be, you generally want the groove that's going to hold the panel to be centered in your pieces because it gives equal support to both sides. But in this case, I want that groove slightly off-centered, because I want the bottom side, where the majority of the weight of this thing is going to be distributed, I want it to be slightly thicker. So when I was milling my stock, I milled everything down to 0.79 of an inch, which is just about 3/4 of an inch plus an extra about a 1/16. And so what I'm left with here is I've got a 1/4 inch on the bottom, I've got my 3/8 groove, then I've got 3/16 on the top. So if I was to go down to 3/4 inch stock exactly, I'd be left with 3/16 on the bottom and 3/16 on the top. But by adding that extra 1/16 of an inch to the bottom area, it's just a little bit stronger than it would be if without that. And so the whole point of this lid is that it's supposed to be decorative and ornamental. If you're going to make something that people were going to sit on, I'd stick with the breadboard end, the more simplistic breadboard end top that would be a much stronger and, would support more weight. But in this instance, in case somebody does sit on this for some reason, I want to make sure that it can at least support that weight. So again, by having that extra 1/16 of an inch on the bottom, it's just going to make it that much stronger. Again, where I can squeeze on these, I can put full force on them and only get a little bit of movement, which is good. And so we now have the solid completed frame. So I have to say, between the dado stack and the mortiser, this is just about the best possible combination for mortise and tenon joinery. Everything you can sneak up so precise. Well, I shouldn't say the dado stack. The dado stack is part of it, but also the saw stop. The saw stop is such an amazing saw compared to what I've been working with in the past. Just the fact that I can so precisely sneak up on the fit of these tenons so that they are a precision fit. And same thing with the haunch shoulders of the tenons, where we've gone in and filled the 1/2 inch deep gap or groove. That all just works out so perfectly. The accuracy of this machine is just out of this world. Again, compared to what I'm used to, you might have the higher end saw stops might be even better than this one, but this it's. And so the next part of this is going to actually be fitting up the cherry panel. So again, there's two things here that I want to do to this panel to make it fit in here. And so on the top side, we're going to be using this cove profile bit that I used on all the other panels in this thing. And again, this is just going to continue that rounded over look, that nice cove profile that I genuinely love. And so this is going to be very interesting working with this because from Lee Valley, they tell you to only use it in a router table just because it's a fairly large and heavy bit. And so the only way I'm going to be able to do this is by doing it freehand with a router. So I'm going to be taking very, very small passes. Again, it's much smaller than you guys have ever seen me taking a router table. And I'm just going to take all the possible precautions possible because, again, it is kind of a dangerous thing. It is quite a large bit, but I do think that it's completely doable as long as I'm not taking off big chunks at a time. And so then on the bottom side of this panel, I'm just going to be putting a simple rabbet around the inside. Again, I'm going to be using the router for that because trying to manhandle this thing onto a table saw, mainly the long edges would be easy to do with the dado stack already set up, but it's the side edges where it really would be much more challenging to get a good, clean, straight dado. So I think that the best way to do this is going to be working with the router, and luckily I have two pretty good quality routers that I know that I can do this with. Alright, so we are making really good progress on the lid here. I am so very glad I chose to just completely redo this thing from scratch because this is coming out absolutely beautifully. So I've got all the mortise and tenon fitted up. We've got the holes drilled into the outside pieces. We still got to drill them into the tenons, but we're going to do that in a few steps here. So everything that I've gone through and done so far is I put the cove profile on the top side of the lid, so we've got a nice smooth profile up there. Now, the one thing that I would like to do, but I'm not going to do it because it's a little bit too late for it. Lee Valley sells a cove profile bit, the same one that I have, just an extra 1/2 inch longer. And so that would just put the cove a little bit deeper in. So in the future, if I was going to make another one of these, I'd probably go pick up that bit. But they're out of stock anyway, and it's another $100 to spend on a router bit that I don't particularly need. This looks just fine in my opinion. And so on the underside, you guys remember I mentioned that we were going to have a little bit of a gap between the panel, or between the cherry panel and the walnut piece on the outside to allow for some wood movement. Well, I went in, and when I put that all together, I thought that the groove looked good, but I wanted to add a very small chamfer just to help break it up. And so I did that with a V-point bit in my router. Now the big difference between a V-point bit and a chamfer bit is that a V-point bit doesn't have a bearing or anything on it. It is just, it's exactly as it sounds. It's a V with a little point on it. This one comes down to a flat. Sometimes it'll come down to an actual sharp point. But yeah, the one that I have comes down to a flat. And so what I meant to do was just to take a very small bite and put a light little chamfer on that inside edge. What I ended up doing was taking a much bigger bite than I expected because I didn't have it set up properly, or I think I moved my arm, something weird happened, and I realized that I really liked the look of it. So it was one of those happy accidents that I think has made a massive difference to the overall look of this thing. Because I then was able to put the bit all the way down so that we were just above the reference surface for the bottom of the lid here. And so now we need to go through and do all of our finishing work. So I've got a freshly sharpened 40-degree blade in here. I've got the blade all set up to a perfect depth for finishing, so I'm just taking off these super thin passes, and I'm really not going to be doing anything complex here.